Tonight's story begins with a single moment, a crying child reaching for comfort from a stranger. But this wasn't just any stranger. This was Alexander Drake, New York's most feared billionaire CEO. And what happens next will shatter everything he thought he knew about love, betrayal, and the family he never knew existed. Welcome to Gilded Hearts. Before we dive into Alexander's world of luxury and heartbreak, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. This is a story about second chances and buried secrets. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because stories like these deserve to reach every corner of the world. Like, share, and let's begin. The wedding of the century was unfolding in Manhattan's most prestigious venue, the Plaza Hotel's Grand Ballroom. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbows across marble floors polished to mirror perfection. Silk drapes in ivory and gold-framed towering windows that offered breathtaking views of Central Park. The scent of white orchids and gardenias filled the air, their petals scattered along the aisle like fallen snow. This wasn't just any wedding. This was where Manhattan's elite gathered to see and be seen, where billion-dollar deals were whispered over champagne flutes, and where reputations could be made or destroyed with a single glance. The guest list read like a who's who of American aristocracy, tech moguls, oil heiresses, media empires, and political dynasties all mingling beneath the glittering lights. But among all these titans of industry, one man commanded attention without even trying. Alexander Drake stood near the altar, his presence so commanding that conversation seemed to quiet in his vicinity. At 35, he possessed the kind of magnetism that made others instinctively step aside when he walked through a room. His custom-tailored black suit, crafted by London's most exclusive tailor, fit his broad shoulders and lean frame like liquid silk. The Patek Philippe watch on his wrist cost more than most people's annual salaries, yet he wore it with the casual indifference of someone for whom luxury was simply oxygen. His hair, dark as midnight, was perfectly styled in that effortless way that actually required considerable effort to achieve. But it was his eyes that truly set him apart. Sharp green eyes that seemed to catalog and evaluate everything they saw. Those eyes had stared down hostile boardrooms, intimidated competitors into submission, and closed deals worth billions with nothing more than a calculated look. Alexander Drake wasn't just wealthy, he was power incarnate. His name graced the tallest skyscraper in Manhattan, a gleaming tower of steel and glass that pierced the clouds like a modern-day Tower of Babel. Drake Industries had tentacles reaching into every sector imaginable: real estate, technology, finance, media. When Alexander spoke, markets listened. When he frowned, stock prices trembled. Yet tonight, standing in this opulent ballroom surrounded by society's finest, there was something almost untouchable about his stillness. He didn't mingle like the other guests. He didn't smile at the small talk or laugh at the carefully crafted jokes designed to impress. Instead, he observed everything with the detached interest of a chess master studying his next move. The other guests whispered about him behind champagne flutes and designer handbags. They spoke of his meteoric rise from a middle-class background to the very pinnacle of American capitalism. They marveled at his Midas touch, how every investment turned to gold, every venture succeeded beyond imagination. But they also whispered about something else, his notorious coldness when it came to matters of the heart. For 6 years, Alexander Drake had been Manhattan's most eligible bachelor and most impenetrable fortress rolled into one. Beautiful women had tried to scale his walls. Ambitious socialites had attempted to breach his defenses. Yet none had succeeded in touching whatever heart beat beneath that perfectly pressed shirt. He attended charity galas alone, arrived at premieres solo, and left every social gathering exactly as he had entered, untouchable, unreachable, and utterly alone. The wedding ceremony itself was a masterpiece of orchestrated perfection. The bride, radiant in her custom Vera Wang gown, seemed to float down the aisle as if walking on air. The groom, tears glistening in his eyes, looked like every romantic fantasy brought to life. Their love was palpable, electric, the kind that made even the most cynical observer believe in happily ever after. But Alexander watched it all with those calculating green eyes, his expression unreadable. If the sight of true love being celebrated stirred anything within him, he gave no indication. His hands remained steady, his breathing even, his posture perfect. He was a statue carved from marble, beautiful and cold and absolutely still. As the couple exchanged vows, speaking of forever and always, of love that would conquer all obstacles, something almost imperceptible shifted across Alexander's features. It was gone so quickly that anyone watching might have imagined it, a flicker of something that looked suspiciously like longing. But then it was gone, buried beneath layers of carefully constructed armor. The reception began with all the fanfare befitting an event of this magnitude. Waiters glided through the crowd like ballet dancers, offering delicacies that cost more per bite than most people's dinners. The champagne flowed like golden rivers, each bottle worth more than a luxury car. A string quartet, flown in from Vienna specifically for this occasion, filled the air with music so beautiful it seemed to make even the flowers bloom brighter. Alexander moved through this glittering paradise like a shadow made solid. He spoke when spoken to, his voice carrying the distinctive authority that made everyone lean in to listen. He shook hands with fellow CEOs, discussed market trends with hedge fund managers, and fielded invitations to exclusive events with polite declinations. He was present but not really there, participating but not truly engaged. It was during the cocktail hour, as golden hour light streamed through the massive windows, that something unexpected began to unfold. The adult guests were absorbed in their own worlds, making connections, closing deals, gossiping about who was wearing what designer and who had arrived with whom. The champagne had loosened tongues and lowered guards, creating the particular atmosphere of sophisticated revelry that only Manhattan's elite could manufacture. But in all this adult indulgence, a small figure moved unnoticed through the crowd. A little boy, no older than 5, dressed in a miniature tuxedo that made him look like a doll come to life. His hair was dark and slightly mussed despite obvious attempts to keep it neat. His small hands clutched at the fabric of his formal, wear as if it were uncomfortable, foreign to his young frame. The child seemed lost in this sea of towering adults, his wide eyes darting from one face to another, searching for something or someone familiar. The guests, wrapped up in their own importance, barely noticed his small form weaving between legs and around conversations. To them, he was just another accessory to the evening's grandeur, like the flowers or the music, decorative but ultimately irrelevant to their adult concerns. But children have a way of sensing emotional distress that adults often lose somewhere between innocence and ambition. And this little boy was growing increasingly distressed. His bottom lip began to tremble as he realized he was alone in this overwhelming crowd of strangers. His breathing became quick and shallow, the way children breathe when panic starts to set in. Alexander was engaged in conversation with a Japanese tech mogul, discussing potential joint ventures in the emerging AI market, when something made him pause mid-sentence. It wasn't a sound so much as the absence of sound, a break in the conversational hum that drew his attention like a discordant note in an otherwise perfect symphony. That's when he saw the boy. The child had found himself cornered near a towering arrangement of white lilies, tears streaming down his cheeks as the reality of being lost in this vast adult world finally overwhelmed him. His small shoulders shook with silent sobs, and his hands had balled into tiny fists, wiping at his eyes in that heartbreaking way that only children cry, with complete abandonment to their emotions. For a moment, Alexander simply stared. Something about the sight of this small, vulnerable figure amidst all the adult grandeur seemed to pierce through the carefully constructed walls around his heart. The businessman in him wanted to alert hotel security, to handle this disruption efficiently and return to his conversation. But something deeper, something he hadn't felt in years, made him excuse himself from the tech mogul and walk toward the crying child. As Alexander approached, the boy looked up with eyes that were red-rimmed but startlingly beautiful. They were large and expressive, fringed with dark lashes, and filled with a kind of trust that only children possessed, the belief that any adult might be a potential savior. And in that moment, as their eyes met across the glittering ballroom, something extraordinary happened. The most powerful man in New York, the billionaire who had built an empire on ruthless calculation and emotional detachment, felt his heart crack open just enough to let in a whisper of the warmth he'd buried 6 years ago. What neither of them knew was that this moment, this simple interaction between a lost child and a lonely man, was about to unravel secrets that had been carefully buried, lies that had been perfectly crafted, and a love story that had been violently interrupted but never truly ended. The child's tears were about to wash away more than just the makeup on his small cheeks. They were about to cleanse away years of carefully constructed defenses and reveal a truth that would change everything Alexander thought he knew about love, loss, and the family he never knew existed. Alexander Drake owned New York. Not in the metaphorical sense that politicians or celebrities might claim ownership of a city, but in the very literal, documented, legally binding sense that only comes with having your signature on enough deeds, contracts, and acquisition papers to actually possess the concrete and steel heart of America's greatest metropolis. From the 92nd floor of Drake Tower, Alexander's corner office offered a view that most people could only dream of experiencing. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around two walls of his private domain, providing a panoramic vista of Manhattan that stretched from the Hudson River to the East River, from Central Park's Emerald Rectangle to the glittering harbor where Lady Liberty stood sentinel. On clear days like this one, he could see all the way to the curve of the Earth's horizon, a reminder that even from this impossible height, there were still worlds beyond his reach. The office itself was a testament to power exercised with surgical precision. Italian marble floors reflected the afternoon sun streaming through those magnificent windows. The walls that weren't glass were lined with rich mahogany paneling, imported from forests that had grown for centuries before being transformed into the backdrop for billion-dollar decisions. Behind his desk, a masterpiece of craftsmanship carved from a single piece of ebony, hung original paintings by masters whose names were whispered in auction houses with the reverence usually reserved for deities. But it wasn't the luxury that commanded respect when visitors entered this space. It was the man who sat behind that ebony desk, studying the world he had conquered with eyes the color of winter storms. Alexander Drake at 35 was what happened when ambition met opportunity, when intelligence was sharpened by hunger, and when determination was forged in the fires of absolute necessity. His empire stretched across industries like a spider's web designed by a mathematical genius. Drake Industries had tentacles in real estate developments that reshaped skylines, technology ventures that predicted the future, financial instruments that moved markets, and media acquisitions that shaped public opinion. When Alexander spoke, algorithms listened. When he made decisions, entire sectors of the economy held their breath. The numbers were staggering in their scope and almost incomprehensible in their magnitude. His personal wealth exceeded the GDP of small nations. The companies under his control employed hundreds of thousands of people across 6 continents. The investments flowing through his various funds could fund space programs or end famines, build cities or topple governments. Yet he wore this tremendous power like others might wear a well-tailored jacket, comfortably, casually, as if it had always belonged to him. His custom-tailored suits were crafted by the same Savile Row tailors who had dressed British royalty for generations. Each one cost more than most people spent on transportation in an entire year, yet Alexander owned dozens of them, each perfectly fitted to his lean, athletic frame. The shoes on his feet were handcrafted in Italy by artisans whose waiting lists stretched for years. The watch on his wrist was a limited edition Patek Philippe that could have purchased a luxury home in most American cities. But perhaps most remarkably, Alexander wore all of this extraordinary wealth with an indifference that bordered on the supernatural. He moved through his world of privilege as if comfort were his natural state, as if having more money than entire countries was simply the baseline from which life began. There was no ostentation in his bearing, no need to prove anything to anyone. His power announced itself through his mere presence. When Alexander entered a boardroom, conversations ceased. When he walked through the lobby of his building, employees straightened unconsciously. When he arrived at social gatherings, the very atmosphere seemed to shift, as if the air itself recognized his authority. He possessed that rarest of qualities among the wealthy, true confidence that required no external validation. Yet for all his success, for all the empires he had built and the fortunes he had amassed, there remained one possession that had always eluded him. One prize that his billions could not purchase, his influence could not command, and his intelligence could not solve. Love. Real, honest, transformative love had touched his life exactly once, and when it vanished, it had left behind a wound that 6 years of unprecedented success could not heal. The evidence of this hidden pain was subtle, visible only to those who knew how to look for it. On his desk, among the crystal awards and platinum deal toys that commemorated his greatest triumphs, sat a single silver picture frame. It faced down, its contents hidden from view, yet its presence spoke volumes about the man who could conquer markets but could not conquer his own heart. Isabella Hart. Even thinking her name was like pressing on a bruise that had never properly healed. 6 years had passed since she had walked out of his life, yet her memory remained as vivid and painful as if she had left yesterday. She had been everything his world of calculated ambition was not: spontaneous where he was planned, warm where he was cool, generous where he was cautious. She had been light itself, and when she left, she had taken all the warmth from his world with her. Alexander had met Isabella during the early days of his empire, when he was still building rather than simply managing his fortune. She had been working as an art curator at a small gallery in Soho, surrounded by beauty but earning barely enough to pay rent on a studio apartment in Brooklyn. Their worlds should never have collided, yet fate had brought them together at a charity auction where Alexander was bidding on a Rothko and Isabella was providing authentication services. She hadn't been impressed by his wealth. That alone had been enough to intrigue him, but it was her passion for beauty, her genuine love of art, and her complete indifference to his status that had gradually broken down his defenses. Isabella saw through the billionaire exterior to the man underneath, the man who still remembered what it felt like to be hungry, who still worked 16-hour days not because he had to but because he couldn't stop, who used success as armor against a world that had once overlooked him. Their romance had unfolded like something from a movie. Long walks through Central Park where they talked about everything except business. Intimate dinners at small restaurants where Isabella introduced him to cuisines he'd never experienced despite being able to afford the finest meals in the world. Quiet evenings in her tiny apartment where she would curl up beside him on her second-hand couch, reading aloud from books of poetry while he marveled at how someone could make such simple moments feel more valuable than any deal he'd ever closed. Isabella had softened him in ways he hadn't known were possible. Under her influence, Alexander began to remember what it felt like to laugh without calculating the social advantage of humor. He started to experience moments of genuine joy that weren't tied to profit margins or market share. For the first time in his adult life, he began to consider that perhaps success wasn't just about accumulating power, perhaps it was about finding someone worth sharing that power with. He had loved her with the same intensity he brought to everything else in his life, but love was different from business. Love required vulnerability, and vulnerability was a luxury Alexander had never been able to afford. He loved Isabella completely, but he loved her carefully, always maintaining just enough emotional distance to protect himself if everything fell apart. That caution should have prepared him for what came next, but nothing could have prepared him for the morning he woke up to find her gone. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how Alexander Drake became the man standing in that wedding ballroom, we need to understand the enemy who had been circling him for years, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. If Alexander Drake was the king of New York's financial district, then Ethan Caldwell was the serpent who had been slithering through his garden since their Harvard Business School days. Where Alexander commanded through competence and results, Ethan wielded influence through charm and manipulation. Where Alexander built his empire on the solid foundation of successful ventures, Ethan constructed his power base on carefully cultivated relationships and strategic betrayals. Ethan Caldwell possessed the kind of devastating good looks that opened doors before his impressive resume even came into play. Golden hair that seemed to catch light even in dim rooms, blue eyes that sparkled with seemingly genuine warmth, and a smile that had been perfected through years of practice in front of mirrors and cameras. He was 2 years younger than Alexander but had mastered the art of appearing both sophisticated and approachable, dangerous and trustworthy, ambitious and loyal. His own corporate headquarters, housed in a gleaming tower just 12 blocks from Drake Industries, served as the nerve center for Caldwell Enterprises. While his empire was smaller than Alexander's, it was no less impressive in its reach and influence. Ethan had built his fortune in the shadows of more established players, acquiring companies that others overlooked, investing in technologies that seemed too risky for traditional portfolios, and cultivating relationships with power brokers who preferred to operate behind the scenes. But Ethan's true genius wasn't in business, it was in understanding people. He possessed an almost supernatural ability to identify what others wanted most and then position himself as the person who could provide it. Politicians seeking financial backing, socialites craving validation, journalists hungry for exclusive stories, Ethan collected them all like rare butterflies, pinned and mounted in his personal museum of useful connections. His rivalry with Alexander had roots that stretched back to their graduate school days, when both young men were already displaying the ambition and intelligence that would define their careers. They had been friends then, or at least Alexander had thought they were friends. Late nights in the library, study groups that turned into philosophical discussions about the nature of success, shared dreams of conquering the business world. It had all seemed genuine at the time. But even then, Ethan had been studying Alexander more than he had been befriending him. He watched how Alexander approached problems, cataloged his strengths and weaknesses, and began to understand that his classmate possessed something Ethan himself lacked, an authenticity that couldn't be manufactured, a natural authority that couldn't be learned. As their careers progressed and their fortunes grew, Ethan's envy had metastasized into something more dangerous. It wasn't enough to be successful in his own right. He needed Alexander to fail. It wasn't enough to build his own empire. He needed to tear down Alexander's. Most importantly, it wasn't enough to find love for himself. He needed to destroy any chance Alexander had of finding happiness. The opportunity had presented itself 6 years ago in the form of Isabella Hart. Ethan had recognized immediately that Alexander's girlfriend represented a vulnerability that could be exploited. Love made people careless, made them prioritize emotion over logic, made them weak. All Ethan had to do was find the right pressure points and apply them with surgical precision. The plan he had crafted was elegant in its cruelty and devastating in its effectiveness. But those details would come to light later, when the full scope of his betrayal would be revealed. For now, it was enough to know that Ethan Caldwell had spent 6 years believing he had won the ultimate victory over his rival. He had cost Alexander the only woman he had ever loved. Now, as Ethan sat in his own opulent office reviewing the guest list for his cousin's wedding, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Alexander would be there, of course. Business relationships sometimes required such social obligations, and Alexander was nothing if not dutiful in maintaining the connections that kept his empire running smoothly. The wedding would be the perfect stage for Ethan to remind Alexander of everything he had lost. Not directly, of course. Ethan was far too sophisticated for such crude tactics. Instead, he would use subtle references, carefully placed comments, and the weight of shared history to reopen old wounds. It would be exquisite torture, and Alexander would be powerless to respond without appearing petty or unprofessional. Ethan's phone buzzed with a text message that made his smile widen. Everything was falling into place exactly as he had planned. Alexander Drake might own half of Manhattan, but Ethan Caldwell owned his pain, and that was a currency more valuable than any stock option or real estate deed. The wedding invitation had arrived at Alexander's office on cream-colored cardstock, so thick it felt more like fabric than paper. The calligraphy was hand-lettered by artists whose services were booked years in advance. The details promised an event that would be talked about in society pages for months. St. Patrick's Cathedral for the ceremony, followed by a reception at the Plaza Hotel that would spare no expense in creating an unforgettable evening. Alexander had initially declined. Social obligations were a necessary evil in his world, but this particular gathering held too many potential complications. Ethan's presence alone would be enough to put him on edge, and large social events had never been his preference even under the best circumstances. But business was business, and some relationships were too important to risk over personal discomfort. The bride's family controlled shipping interests that intersected with several of Alexander's ventures. The groom's father sat on the board of a technology company that Drake Industries was courting for acquisition. A dozen other attendees represented connections that could prove valuable in future deals. So Alexander had accepted, with the same resignation he might show when scheduling a root canal. He would attend, make the necessary appearances, engage in the required conversations, and leave as soon as politely possible. It was just another item on his calendar, another obligation to be efficiently managed and quickly completed. He couldn't have known that this wedding would become the stage for a confrontation 6 years in the making. He couldn't have predicted that a single evening would unravel secrets that had been carefully buried and lies that had been perfectly crafted. Most of all, he couldn't have imagined that a crying child would become the key to unlocking a truth that would change everything he thought he knew about love, loss, and the family he never knew existed. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, with a kind of perfect autumn weather that made Manhattan feel like the center of the universe. Alexander's routine was as precisely choreographed as everything else in his life. A workout in his private gym while reviewing market reports from Tokyo and London. A breakfast prepared by his personal chef while he conducted conference calls with division heads in 3 different time zones. A review of his schedule with his assistant, who had managed to clear his evening after the reception for a flight to Los Angeles, where a deal worth $200 million was waiting for his signature. His driver was waiting in the lobby at exactly 5:30, the Bentley polished to mirror perfection despite the fact that it would only be traveling 15 blocks to the cathedral. Alexander slid into the leather seat and immediately opened his tablet, using the brief journey to review the final details of a merger that would be announced the following week. But as the car pulled up to St. Patrick's Cathedral, something made him pause in his reading. The sight of the massive Gothic structure, with its towering spires reaching toward heaven and its ornate facade bearing witness to countless human dramas, stirred something unexpected in his chest. This was where dreams came true and hearts were broken, where promises were made and futures were decided. The paparazzi were already stationed outside, their cameras clicking like mechanical insects as Manhattan's elite stepped from limousines and town cars. Alexander emerged from his Bentley with the fluid grace of someone who had been photographed thousands of times, his expression neutral, his posture perfect, his dark suit immaculate despite the October breeze that ruffled his hair. He paused for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to provide the photographs that tomorrow's society pages would require, but not so long as to suggest he was courting publicity. Then he climbed the cathedral steps with measured strides, nodding to acquaintances but not stopping to chat, making his way through the crowd with the purposeful movement of a man who had somewhere important to be. Inside the cathedral, the scene was breathtaking in its grandeur. Every pew was filled with guests whose combined net worth could have funded small countries. The altar was decorated with thousands of white roses and lilies, their fragrance mixing with the ancient incense that seemed to permeate the very stones of this sacred space. Stained glass windows cast rainbow light across faces that regularly graced magazine covers and corporate boardrooms. Alexander found his assigned seat halfway down the aisle, close enough to the front to reflect his importance, but not so close as to suggest an intimacy with the bride and groom that didn't exist. He settled into the wooden pew with the same composed demeanor he brought to board meetings, his hands folded in his lap, his attention focused on the ornate altar where two lives were about to be legally and spiritually joined. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of traditional elegance. The bride walked down the aisle like a vision in white silk and French lace, her train flowing behind her like liquid moonlight. The groom's face lit up with genuine joy as he saw her approaching, and for a moment, even Alexander found himself moved by the obvious love radiating from the couple. The vows they exchanged were personal and heartfelt, speaking of forever and always, of love that would conquer all obstacles, of two souls becoming one. The priest's words about the sanctity of marriage and the blessing of finding one's other half echoed through the cathedral's vaulted ceilings, reaching even the most cynical hearts in the congregation. But Alexander listened to it all with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. Love might be real for other people, but it was a luxury he had learned to live without. Romance was a distraction that weakened judgment and clouded decision-making. Better to focus on tangible achievements, measurable successes, concrete results that couldn't disappear without warning or explanation. The reception at the Plaza Hotel was everything the invitation had promised and more. The grand ballroom had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, with crystal chandeliers casting starlight across tables draped in silk and centered with arrangements of rare orchids that had been flown in from Thailand specifically for this event. The champagne was vintage Dom Perignon, served in crystal flutes that sang like tiny bells when they touched. The orchestra, comprised of musicians from the New York Philharmonic, filled the air with melodies that seemed to make even the flowers dance. Alexander moved through this glittering paradise with his usual composed efficiency, making conversation with business associates, acknowledging acquaintances with polite nods, and fielding the inevitable questions about his own romantic status with practiced deflection. Yes, business was excellent. No, he wasn't seeing anyone seriously. Yes, he would be sure to let them know when there was news worth sharing. It was during the cocktail hour, as golden light streamed through the ballroom's massive windows and the champagne began to work its magic on the assembled guests, that Alexander noticed the child. The little boy couldn't have been more than 5 years old, dressed in a miniature tuxedo that made him look like a doll come to life. His dark hair was slightly mussed despite obvious attempts to keep it neat, and his small hands kept tugging at his bow tie as if the formal wear was uncomfortable and foreign to his young frame. What struck Alexander first was how alone the child seemed in this sea of adults. The wedding guests were absorbed in their own sophisticated conversations, mergers and acquisitions, political developments, social gossip, investment strategies. They moved through their glittering world like celestial bodies following predetermined orbits, beautiful and distant and utterly self-contained. But children operated by different rules. They needed attention, comfort, security. They required the kind of emotional availability that most of these guests had long ago traded for professional success and social advancement. So the little boy moved through the crowd like a ghost, invisible to the adults whose conversations flowed over his head like water over stone. Alexander found himself watching the child with growing concern. There was something familiar about the boy's features, something that tugged at memories Alexander couldn't quite access. The shape of his face, the way he moved, even his obvious discomfort with formal situations, it all resonated in ways that defied logical explanation. The moment that changed everything began with such ordinary circumstances that it might have been scripted by fate itself. The boy, increasingly overwhelmed by the crowd and noise, had taken refuge near a massive arrangement of white lilies in a quiet corner of the ballroom. But instead of finding the peace he sought, the child finally succumbed to the stress of being lost in this adult world. His bottom lip began to tremble. His wide eyes filled with tears that spilled over his cheeks like tiny rivers of distress. His small shoulders shook with a kind of helpless sobs that only children can produce, completely abandoned to emotion, without the adult ability to mask or minimize their pain. Alexander was across the room, engaged in conversation with a Japanese technology mogul about potential joint ventures in artificial intelligence, when something made him pause mid-sentence. It wasn't a sound so much as the absence of sound, a break in the conversational symphony that drew his attention like a discordant note in an otherwise perfect performance. That's when he saw the crying child clearly for the first time. The little boy had pressed himself against the marble column supporting the flower arrangement, as if trying to make himself small enough to disappear. His tears were flowing freely now, and his small hands were balled into fists, wiping at his eyes in that heartbreaking way that children cry when they believe no one cares enough to help them. For a moment, Alexander simply stared. The sight of this small, vulnerable figure amidst all the adult grandeur seemed to pierce through the carefully constructed armor around his heart. The businessman in him recognized that this was not his problem. Hotel staff or security could handle the situation efficiently. The pragmatist in him knew that getting involved would only complicate his evening and delay his planned departure. But something deeper, something he hadn't felt in 6 long years, made him excuse himself from the technology mogul and walk toward the crying child. It was compassion, pure and simple, the kind of authentic human connection that his wealth and power couldn't purchase or his intelligence couldn't calculate. As Alexander approached, the boy looked up with eyes that were red-rimmed but startlingly beautiful. They were large and dark, fringed with thick lashes, and filled with a kind of desperate hope that only children possessed. The belief that any adult might be a potential savior, that help could come from the most unexpected sources. Alexander knelt beside the child, bringing himself down to eye level in a gesture that came so naturally, he didn't even think about the potential damage to his expensive suit. His voice, when he spoke, was softer than it had been in years, gentle in a way that his boardroom colleagues would never recognize. "Hey there," he said quietly, his tone carrying none of his usual authority but all of his natural warmth. "What's wrong? Are you lost?" The boy nodded, fresh tears spilling down his cheeks. "I can't find my mommy," he whispered, his voice thick with a kind of fear that came from being small in a world designed for giants. Alexander felt something crack open in his chest, not painfully, but like ice breaking apart to let spring water flow. "Well, we can't have that," he said, reaching out to gently brush away the child's tears with his thumb. "My name is Alexander. What's yours?" "Daniel," the boy replied, his small voice gaining strength from Alexander's calm presence. "That's a strong name," Alexander told him, and found himself smiling for the first time in longer than he could remember. "Daniel, I promise we're going to find your mommy. You're safe now, okay? I won't let anything happen to you." The transformation was immediate and profound. Daniel's tears slowed, then stopped altogether. His small shoulders relaxed, and he took a step closer to Alexander, drawn by some instinctive recognition of safety and protection. Without thinking, the child reached out and grasped Alexander's hand with his tiny fingers, and in that moment, something extraordinary happened. Alexander Drake, the billionaire who controlled more wealth than some nations, felt more powerful and more vulnerable than he had ever felt in his life. This small hand in his seemed to anchor him to something real, something that mattered more than stock prices or merger agreements or quarterly earnings reports. For the first time in years, he was experiencing pure, uncomplicated human connection. The little boy's trust was absolute and immediate. He looked up at Alexander with eyes that held no calculation, no agenda, no awareness of wealth or status. To Daniel, Alexander wasn't a CEO or a billionaire or a master of the universe. He was simply a kind man who had stopped to help when help was needed. They stood together in that corner of the glittering ballroom, the powerful businessman and the lost child, while the adult world swirled around them in its orchestrated dance of social positioning and professional networking. Neither of them knew that this moment, this simple human connection, was about to trigger a chain of events that would expose secrets buried for 6 years and lies crafted with surgical precision. The voice that cut through the crowd came from somewhere behind Alexander, clear and familiar and impossible. Daniel. The single word hit Alexander like a physical blow. He knew that voice. He had heard it in his dreams for 6 years, had tried to forget it through countless hours of work and countless nights of sleepless ambition. It was a voice that belonged to his past, to a chapter of his life he had believed was closed forever. Alexander's head snapped up, his body going rigid with shock. Time seemed to slow, then stop completely. The sounds of the reception, the orchestra, the conversations, the clink of crystal, faded into absolute silence. The world narrowed to this single moment, this impossible possibility. And then he saw her. Isabella Hart stood 20 feet away, her hand pressed to her chest as if trying to keep her heart from breaking free from her ribs. She was more beautiful than his memory had preserved, more radiant than his dreams had dared to imagine. 6 years had refined her features without diminishing their warmth, had added sophistication to her natural elegance without erasing the joy that had first captured his heart. But it was her eyes that stopped his breath completely. Those soft brown eyes he had loved so desperately were fixed on Daniel, on the little boy whose hand was still clasped trustingly in Alexander's. And in those eyes, Alexander saw something that made his entire world tilt on its axis. Recognition. Love. And most shocking of all, a mother's fierce, protective terror. The voice that haunted his dreams. The voice he thought he'd never hear again. The voice that was calling to the child whose features suddenly, impossibly, looked so familiar because they looked like his own. What would you have done in Alexander's place? Would you have approached the child, or would you have walked away to protect your heart? Let me know in the comments, because what happens next will change everything. 6 years had only made her more breathtaking. But the woman who reached for Daniel wasn't the girl who had vanished from Alexander's life without explanation or warning. This Isabella carried secrets in the shadows beneath her eyes, bore the weight of untold stories in the careful way she held her shoulders, and moved with the cautious grace of someone who had learned to navigate dangerous waters alone. Isabella Hart at 29 was everything Alexander remembered and nothing like the woman he had lost. Her dark hair, once worn loose and carefree, was now styled in an elegant updo that spoke of careful morning routines and precious time stolen for more pressing concerns. Her dress, a simple but sophisticated navy blue that hugged her curves without ostentation, was beautiful but not designer, elegant but not expensive. She wore it with a kind of confidence that came from making careful choices with limited resources. But it was her face that stopped Alexander's breath completely. The years had refined her features without diminishing their essential warmth. Her cheekbones were more pronounced now, carved by the lean years of raising a child alone. Her lips, once quick to smile at his smallest jest, were pressed into a line of maternal concern that spoke of sleepless nights and constant vigilance. And her eyes, those soft brown eyes that had once looked at him with such complete trust and overwhelming love, now held depths he didn't recognize, secrets he couldn't fathom. She moved toward them with the fluid urgency of a mother responding to her child's distress, but her gaze never left Alexander's face. In her expression, he could read a dozen emotions cycling through in rapid succession: shock, fear, longing, panic, love, and something that looked disturbingly like guilt. The distance between them seemed to stretch into infinity, though she was only 20 feet away. Alexander felt as if he were watching her approach through water, everything slowed and distorted by the impossibility of this moment. His grip on Daniel's small hand tightened unconsciously, as if the child were an anchor keeping him tethered to reality. When Isabella finally reached them, she knelt gracefully beside her son, her movements careful and controlled despite the chaos that Alexander could see churning behind her eyes. She gathered Daniel into her arms with the fierce protectiveness of a mother who had spent years being the only barrier between her child and the world's cruelties. "Mommy," Daniel said, his voice muffled against her shoulder, "I was scared, but Alexander helped me. He's really nice." Alexander watched Isabella's face crumble at her son's words. For just a moment, her careful composure slipped, and he saw the raw pain she had been carrying. Her eyes filled with unshed tears as she held Daniel closer, as if she could shield him from the complications his innocent words had just unleashed. "I know, baby," she whispered into Daniel's dark hair. "I'm so sorry I lost track of you. Are you okay? Did anyone hurt you?" As she spoke, Alexander found himself studying Daniel's features with the methodical intensity he usually reserved for complex financial documents. The child's profile, seen clearly now in the ballroom's crystal light, was like looking at a photograph of himself as a boy. The strong jawline, the way his hair grew in a slight cowlick at the crown, the shape of his ears, details that individually might mean nothing, but together formed an undeniable pattern. But it was Daniel's eyes that provided the final devastating confirmation. When the boy turned to look back at Alexander, those eyes were the exact shade of green that Alexander saw every morning in his bathroom mirror. Not similar, identical. The same unusual color that had been passed down through generations of Drake men, from his grandfather to his father to him. The math was simple, even for a mind reeling with shock. Daniel was 5 years old. Isabella had disappeared from his life 6 years ago, vanishing without explanation just as their relationship had been deepening into something that felt like forever. 6 years ago, she could have been carrying his child and never told him. 6 years ago, she could have been pregnant and terrified and alone, making impossible choices for reasons he couldn't begin to understand. And those eyes, those were Drake eyes. There was no mistaking the genetic signature that marked Daniel as his son. Alexander's entire world tilted on its axis. Everything he thought he knew about the past 6 years, every assumption he had made about Isabella's departure, every wall he had built around his heart to protect himself from further betrayal, it all crumbled in the space between one heartbeat and the next. He was a father. He had a son. For 5 years, somewhere in this vast city, his child had been growing up without him, taking first steps Alexander never saw, speaking first words he never heard, celebrating birthdays Alexander never knew existed. The realization hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his knees threaten to buckle. His son. His son had been crying and lost at this wedding, and by some miracle of fate, he had been the one to find him. His son had looked up at him with trusting eyes and called him by name, had reached for his hand with the same instinctive recognition that Alexander had felt but couldn't explain. Isabella rose slowly from her crouch, her movements careful and deliberate, as if sudden motion might shatter the fragile peace of this moment. When she finally met Alexander's gaze directly, the impact was like touching a live wire. 6 years of separation, of unanswered questions, of carefully buried longing, it all passed between them in a single look. Alexander. His name on her lips was barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of everything unsaid, everything lost, everything that might have been. Isabella. He managed to say her name without his voice breaking, though it took every ounce of control he possessed. You look beautiful." It was such an inadequate thing to say, given the magnitude of what hung between them. But social conventions existed for moments like this, when the things that needed to be said were too large and too dangerous to speak aloud in a crowded ballroom surrounded by curious strangers. "Thank you for helping Daniel," she said, her voice carefully modulated to reveal nothing of the storm raging behind her eyes. He's not used to crowds like this. I should have been watching him more carefully." "He's a wonderful boy," Alexander replied, and the words felt like glass in his throat. "Very brave. Very kind." Daniel, oblivious to the undercurrents crackling between the adults, piped up with a cheerful honesty that only children possessed. "Alexander, this is my mommy. Mommy, Alexander is really nice and he promised to help me find you, and he did." Isabella's smile for her son was radiant and heartbreaking at once. "He certainly did, sweetheart. What do you say to Alexander for taking such good care of you?" "Thank you, Alexander," Daniel said solemnly, then surprised everyone by wrapping his small arms around Alexander's legs in a spontaneous hug that nearly brought the billionaire to his knees. The feel of his son's arms around him, the warm weight of the child's trust and affection, was almost more than Alexander could bear. He reached down with trembling hands to gently return the embrace, his large palms spanning Daniel's small back, and for a moment he allowed himself to feel the full impact of what had been stolen from him. 5 years of bedtime stories. 5 years of scraped knees that needed kissing, of picture books that needed reading, of small victories that needed celebrating. 5 years of being needed, of being daddy, of being the most important person in someone's world. 5 years of love that he had never even known he was missing. But now was not the time or place for such revelations. They were standing in the middle of Manhattan's social event of the season, surrounded by hundreds of guests who would dissect and analyze every gesture, every word, every glance. Whatever needed to be said between them would have to wait for privacy, for safety, for the space to speak truths that could destroy reputations and reshape lives. Perhaps, Alexander said carefully, his business training taking over even as his personal world imploded, we should move somewhere quieter. The reception can be overwhelming, especially for children. Isabella nodded gratefully, recognizing the olive branch for what it was. That would be lovely, thank you. They made their way through the crowd toward the hotel's famous garden terrace, Daniel's small hand clasped securely in Alexander's, while Isabella walked beside them with the careful poise of someone navigating a minefield. Guests turned to watch their passage with the idle curiosity of people who sensed drama but couldn't quite identify its source. But one pair of eyes watched their departure with far more than idle curiosity. From across the ballroom, Ethan Caldwell observed the reunion with the focused intensity of a predator who had just spotted prey wandering into his perfectly constructed trap. Ethan had orchestrated Isabella's exile like a chess master moving pieces across an invisible board, and he had spent 6 years believing his strategy had achieved its ultimate goal. Alexander Drake, the man who seemed to have everything, had been reduced to a lonely billionaire whose wealth couldn't purchase the one thing he wanted most. It had been a masterpiece of psychological warfare, elegant in its cruelty and devastating in its effectiveness. The plan had been years in the making, beginning with careful observation and patient research. Ethan had watched Alexander fall in love with Isabella Hart, had seen his rival's carefully constructed defenses crumble beneath the assault of genuine affection. For the first time in their long acquaintance, Alexander had seemed vulnerable, human, reachable. That vulnerability had been exactly what Ethan needed. The execution had required surgical precision and perfect timing. Isabella's lease had been mysteriously cancelled, her landlord claiming sudden financial difficulties that required immediate vacancy. Her part-time job at the gallery had evaporated when the owner received an anonymous tip about supposed inventory discrepancies. Her scholarship applications for graduate school had been quietly sabotaged through contacts Ethan had cultivated in academic circles. Each setback had been carefully orchestrated to look like unfortunate coincidence rather than deliberate sabotage. Isabella had found herself facing a cascade of problems that seemed unrelated but were actually perfectly coordinated to drive her away from New York and, more importantly, away from Alexander. The final stroke had been Ethan's masterstroke, the forged evidence of Isabella's supposed infidelity. Photographs that appear to show her in intimate situations with another man, testimony from witnesses who had been carefully coached, financial records suggesting she had been secretly meeting with wealthy suitors behind Alexander's back. It had all been fabricated with a kind of attention to detail that Ethan brought to his most important business deals. But Ethan's greatest victory had been psychological. He had positioned himself as Alexander's concerned friend, the loyal companion who reluctantly brought these painful revelations to light. He had been the shoulder Alexander leaned on, the voice of reason counseling him to let Isabella go rather than fight for a woman who had proven herself unworthy of his trust. "Some people can't be saved from their own nature, Alex," Ethan had said during one of their carefully staged conversations. "Isabella showed you who she really is. The question is whether you're going to let her destroy you, or whether you're going to use this experience to make yourself stronger." Alexander, heartbroken and betrayed, had chosen strength. Or what he thought was strength. He had thrown himself into his work with even greater intensity, building walls around his heart that were designed to prevent any future emotional devastation. He had become exactly what Ethan needed him to be, successful, powerful, and utterly alone. For 6 years, Ethan's empire had grown in the shadow of Alexander's isolation. While his rival focused solely on business, Ethan had cultivated the personal relationships and social connections that were the true currency of power in their world. He had positioned himself as the warmer alternative to Alexander's cold efficiency, the charming option when Alexander's intensity became too much to bear. But now, watching Alexander walk away with Isabella and the child who was obviously his son, Ethan felt the first tremor of genuine fear he had experienced in years. If Alexander discovered the truth about what had really happened 6 years ago, if he learned about the son who had been kept from him, if he realized the extent of Ethan's manipulation, Ethan's entire carefully constructed world would come crashing down around him. And Alexander Drake was not a man who forgave easily or forgot quickly. When he went to war, he went to win, and he had resources that could destroy even the most carefully protected empire. No. This reunion could not be allowed to continue. Whatever was happening between Alexander and Isabella needed to be stopped before it could gain momentum. Ethan had worked too hard and risked too much to let sentiment and coincidence destroy everything he had built. He adjusted his cufflinks with practiced nonchalance and began moving through the crowd toward the garden terrace. It was time to remind everyone involved exactly why Isabella Hart had disappeared from Alexander's life in the first place. The hotel's garden terrace was a masterpiece of urban landscape design, a hidden oasis suspended above the city's concrete and steel heart. Fairy lights were strung between carefully pruned trees, casting a warm golden glow over intimate seating areas arranged around a central fountain. The sound of water falling over carved stone provided a gentle counterpoint to the distant hum of Manhattan traffic below. Alexander guided Isabella and Daniel to a secluded corner of the terrace, away from the few other guests who had stepped outside for air or private conversations. The space felt removed from the glittering ballroom, peaceful in a way that made honest conversation seem possible again. Daniel, exhausted by the evening's excitement and reassured by his mother's presence, had begun to droop against Isabella's side. She settled him on a cushioned bench where he could rest while still being part of their conversation, his small head pillowed against her thigh as she absently stroked his dark hair. Alexander remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in the formal posture that was his default when emotions threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained control. The garden's soft lighting cast shadows across his face, emphasizing the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the tension around his eyes. For several minutes, neither adult spoke. The weight of 6 years of separation, of unanswered questions, of carefully buried pain, hung between them like a tangible presence. Finally, Alexander broke the silence with the directness that had made him one of New York's most feared negotiators. "Why did you leave?" The question was simple, but Isabella received it like a physical blow. Her hand stilled in Daniel's hair, and her entire body seemed to draw in on itself as if she could make herself small enough to escape this conversation entirely. "Alexander, she began, then stopped, her voice catching on emotions too large for words. 6 years, Isabella. 6 years without a word, without an explanation, without even a goodbye. I thought you were dead. I thought." He paused, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "I thought I had done something to drive you away. I replayed every conversation, every moment, trying to figure out where I had failed you." Isabella's eyes filled with tears that she fought not to shed. "You didn't fail me. You never failed me. You were perfect. Too perfect. That was the problem. I don't understand." She was quiet for so long that Alexander began to wonder if she would answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, as if the words were being torn from her against her will. "There were threats, Alexander. People who said they would hurt you if I didn't disappear. People who made it very clear that my presence in your life was putting you in danger." Alexander's entire body went rigid. What kind of threats? Who made them? "It doesn't matter now. What matters is that I believed them. I believed that loving you was going to get you killed, and I couldn't live with that possibility." "So you just left? Without talking to me, without letting me help, without trusting me enough to." "I was pregnant." The words hit Alexander like a lightning strike. He actually staggered, his carefully maintained composure cracking like glass under pressure. For a moment, the garden spun around him as the full implications of her confession sank in. "Pregnant," he repeated, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. "With Daniel." Isabella nodded, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. I found out 2 weeks before I left. I was terrified, Alexander. I was 23 years old, unmarried, unemployed, and suddenly facing the prospect of raising a child alone in a city where I could barely afford rent on a studio apartment. You should have told me. His voice was raw with pain and confusion. We could have figured it out together. We could have. Could we? Isabella's question was sharp with a pain that matched his own. You were building an empire, working 18-hour days, traveling constantly for deals and acquisitions. Your entire life was structured around your career, your success, your plans for the future. Where exactly did a pregnant girlfriend and an unplanned baby fit into that picture? The question hung between them like a blade. Alexander wanted to protest, to insist that he would have made room, would have changed his priorities, would have chosen differently. But honesty forced him to acknowledge that Isabella's fears hadn't been entirely unreasonable. 6 years ago, he had been a different man, driven by ambitions that left little space for anything else. I would have done the right thing, he said finally. The right thing, Isabella repeated, her voice hollow. What is the right thing, Alexander? Marrying me because you felt obligated? Rearranging your entire life out of duty rather than choice? Resenting me for trapping you with an unplanned pregnancy? You weren't trapping me. I loved you. I know you did. And I loved you. But love doesn't always solve practical problems, and it doesn't always survive the pressure of unwanted responsibility. Daniel stirred on the bench, murmuring something in his sleep that made Isabella's expression soften with maternal tenderness. She adjusted her position to make him more comfortable, the gesture so natural and practiced that it spoke of thousands of similar moments over the past 5 years. Tell me about him, Alexander said quietly. Tell me about our son. The possessive pronoun seemed to surprise Isabella, though she recovered quickly. He's everything good about both of us and nothing bad about either of us. He's curious and kind and incredibly smart. He loves books and building blocks and anything that involves taking things apart to see how they work. He asks 1,000,000 questions a day and remembers every answer. Alexander's throat tightened as he imagined all the moments he had missed, all the conversations he had never heard, all the questions he hadn't been there to answer. He looks like you, Isabella continued, her voice soft with memory. Especially when he's concentrating on something difficult. He gets this little line between his eyebrows, just like you do when you're reviewing contracts. Does he? Alexander swallowed hard before continuing. Does he ask about his father? Isabella was quiet for a long moment before answering. Every child asks about their father eventually. I've told him that his daddy is a very important man who has to work far away, but that he loves him very much even though they can't be together right now. The careful way she phrased her response told Alexander that this was a conversation she had rehearsed many times, probably in front of her bathroom mirror while preparing for the questions she knew would inevitably come. That must have been difficult. Everything about the last 6 years has been difficult. Her admission was stark in its honesty. But Daniel has been worth every sleepless night, every financial struggle, every moment of uncertainty. He's the best thing I've ever done with my life. As if summoned by her words, Daniel began to wake up, blinking drowsily as he tried to remember where he was. His gaze fell on Alexander, and his small face lit up with the uncomplicated joy that only children possessed. Alexander, he said, his voice thick with sleep, are you still here? I'm still here, Alexander confirmed, his voice gentler than it had been all evening. Daniel sat up straighter, suddenly more alert. Mommy, I like Alexander. He helped me when I was scared, and he has kind eyes like in the pictures. Isabella went very still. What pictures, sweetheart? The pictures in your room. The ones you look at sometimes when you think I'm asleep. You have the same eyes, Daniel said to Alexander with a matter-of-fact observation that children made without understanding their impact. Alexander's gaze snapped to Isabella, who had gone pale as moonlight. You kept pictures? Daniel, why don't you go get a drink of water from the fountain? Isabella said quickly, clearly desperate to redirect the conversation away from dangerous territory. But Daniel was in that wakeful, chatty mood that children sometimes got when they were overtired and overstimulated. "Are you my daddy?" he asked Alexander with devastating directness. "Mommy cries about my daddy sometimes. She thinks I don't know, but I hear her." The silence that followed Daniel's innocent question was deafening. Alexander felt as if the world had stopped spinning, as if time itself had paused to witness this moment of truth. He looked at Isabella, whose face had crumpled with a mixture of love and despair that broke his heart all over again. "Yes," Alexander said quietly, his eyes never leaving Isabella's face. "Yes, Daniel. I'm your daddy." The word seemed to release something in both adults that had been held under tremendous pressure for years. Isabella began to cry in earnest, her careful composure finally cracking under the weight of secrets that had grown too heavy to carry alone. Alexander moved to sit beside Daniel, his movements careful and deliberate, as if he were approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden motion. Daniel, with the remarkable adaptability of childhood, processed this information with far more equanimity than either adult had expected. "I thought so," he said with satisfaction. "You smell like the cologne bottle on Mommy's dresser." Alexander looked at Isabella with raised eyebrows, a question in his green eyes that she couldn't quite meet. "I kept one bottle," she admitted through her tears. From before. I know it was foolish, but sometimes I would smell it and remember what it felt like to be happy." In that moment, Alexander Drake, master of billion-dollar deals, conqueror of hostile takeovers, commander of a financial empire that spanned continents, was just a man who had lost 5 years of his son's life and the woman he had never stopped loving. He reached out tentatively, as if Isabella might disappear again if he moved too quickly, and gently brushed away her tears with his thumb. The touch was electric, carrying the memory of hundreds of similar gestures from their time together, and Isabella leaned into his palm with a sigh that seemed to come from her very soul. "We have so much to figure out," Alexander said softly. "I know. I'm angry, Isabella. I'm angrier than I've ever been in my life. But I'm also grateful that you're here, that he's here, that somehow we found each other again." "I never stopped loving you," she whispered. "Even when I was convinced that leaving was the only way to keep you safe, I never stopped loving you." "Then we'll figure it out," Alexander said with a quiet determination that had built his empire. "All of it. Together this time." It was a beautiful moment, a perfect moment of reunion and forgiveness and hope for the future. It should have been the beginning of their second chance, the first step toward healing years of separation and pain. But Ethan Caldwell had been watching from the terrace doorway, and he had heard enough to understand exactly how much danger he was in. If Alexander and Isabella were allowed to reconcile, if the truth about Daniel's paternity became public knowledge, if anyone started asking questions about how and why Isabella had disappeared 6 years ago, Ethan's empire, built on Alexander's isolation and emotional unavailability, would crumble. More than that, his freedom would be at risk. Some of the methods he had used to drive Isabella away had been illegal, and Alexander had the resources and motivation to uncover every detail of Ethan's manipulation. Time to remind everyone why Isabella Hart had vanished in the first place. "Well, well," Ethan said, stepping out of the shadows with his practiced smile firmly in place. "Alex, you look like you've seen a ghost. Isabella, you look different. Motherhood suits you." The effect of Ethan's appearance was immediate and dramatic. Isabella recoiled as if she had been struck, her entire body tensing with a fear so palpable that even Daniel sensed it. Alexander rose slowly to his feet, his business instinct screaming that danger had just entered their peaceful sanctuary. "Ethan," Alexander said carefully, his voice neutral but his eyes watchful. "I didn't expect to see you out here. I was looking for you, actually. The bride's father wants to discuss that shipping acquisition you've been pursuing. But I see you're busy." Ethan's gaze moved deliberately from Alexander to Isabella to Daniel, and his smile sharpened into something predatory. "Aren't you going to introduce me to your friends?" Alexander noticed how Isabella had gone completely still, like prey trying to avoid the attention of a predator. Her reaction to Ethan's presence was so extreme that it triggered every protective instinct Alexander possessed. "This is Isabella Hart," Alexander said slowly, watching both their faces for clues to whatever subtext he was missing. "Isabella, this is Ethan Caldwell." "Oh, Isabella and I are old friends," Ethan said with jovial false warmth. "Aren't we, Isabella? Though I admit, I'm surprised to see you back in New York. The last time we spoke, you seemed quite determined to stay away permanently." Isabella's face had drained of all color, and her hands were shaking as she reached for Daniel. "We should go," she said quietly. "Daniel needs to get home. It's past his bedtime." "So soon?" Ethan's tone was light, but there was steel underneath. "And I was just getting reacquainted with your charming family. Daniel, isn't it? What a handsome boy. He has his father's eyes, doesn't he?" The words hit Alexander like physical blows. Ethan knew. Somehow, Ethan knew about Daniel's parentage, and the way he was wielding that knowledge suggested it was a weapon rather than a pleasant surprise. "Yes, well, family resemblances can be quite striking," Ethan continued, his voice carrying just enough innuendo to be threatening without being actionable. "Almost as striking as family secrets. Wouldn't you agree, Isabella?" Isabella looked like she was going to be sick. "Please," she whispered. "Not here. Not in front of Daniel." "Of course not," Ethan said with false magnanimity. "Children shouldn't have to hear about their parents' complicated histories. Though I do wonder what stories you've told him about where Daddy has been all these years." Alexander had heard enough. Whatever game Ethan was playing, whatever hold he seemed to have over Isabella, it ended now. "I think you should leave," Alexander said, his voice carrying the authority that had cowed boardrooms full of aggressive executives. "Oh, I don't think so," Ethan replied, his mask of friendliness finally slipping to reveal the malice underneath. "You see, Alex, there are some things about your reunion here that you might want to know. Some things about why Isabella really left, and what she's been doing for the past 6 years." "Stop," Isabella said, her voice breaking. "Please, Ethan. Whatever you want, we can discuss it privately. Don't do this here." "What I want," Ethan said, his voice low and dangerous, "is for you to remember our agreement. You disappeared once to protect the people you love. Are you prepared to do it again?" The threat was clear, even if Alexander didn't understand its full implications. But he understood enough to know that Ethan Caldwell had somehow been involved in Isabella's disappearance, that his presence here tonight was not a coincidence, and that the man he had once considered a friend was actually an enemy who had been playing a very long game. "Whatever agreement you think you had with Isabella is void," Alexander said, moving to stand between Ethan and his family. "She's under my protection now." Ethan laughed, the sound sharp and unpleasant in the garden's peaceful atmosphere. "Your protection? Alex, you don't even know what you're protecting her from. You don't know what she did, what choices she made, what secrets she's been keeping." "Then tell me," Alexander said with deadly calm. "Stop playing games and tell me exactly what you think I should know." "Leave now," Ethan said to Isabella, ignoring Alexander entirely, "or I'll make sure Alexander learns what you really did 6 years ago. And believe me, the truth will destroy whatever fantasy reunion you're imagining." Isabella's face had gone from pale to ashen. Whatever secret Ethan was threatening to reveal, it was powerful enough to terrify her even more than his previous threats had been. "What truth?" Alexander demanded. "What is he talking about, Isabella?" But Isabella couldn't speak. She could only stare at Ethan with the expression of someone watching their entire world crumble around them. Ethan smiled with the satisfaction of a man who had just played his winning card. "Leave New York tomorrow, Isabella. Take your son and disappear again. Or everyone will learn exactly what kind of woman Alexander Drake fell in love with, and exactly what she was willing to do to get her hands on his money." The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander felt as if he had been sucker-punched, his mind reeling as he tried to process what Ethan was suggesting. Isabella looked like she was going to faint, her breathing shallow and rapid as panic threatened to overwhelm her. And Daniel, innocent Daniel, looked back and forth between the adults with growing confusion and fear, sensing the danger in the air even if he couldn't understand its source. "Mommy," he whispered, tugging on Isabella's dress. "Mommy, what's wrong?" But what secret was Ethan hiding? What truth was so damaging that Isabella would rather lose Alexander forever than let him discover it? And how far would a desperate man go to protect the lie he had spent 6 years crafting? Do you believe love can survive this kind of betrayal? And what do you think Isabella's secret could be? Share your theories in the comments, because what happens next will reveal truths that will shake Alexander to his core. Isabella's secret wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't about another man, or hidden wealth, or carefully constructed lies designed to manipulate Alexander's feelings. It was far more devastating than that, and far more heartbreaking. It was about love, not the absence of it, but the terrible, impossible choices that love sometimes demands. The story began 6 years earlier, during the winter when Isabella's world started crumbling around her. She had been living in a state of quiet happiness that felt too perfect to last. Her relationship with Alexander was deepening into something that felt like forever. Her work at the gallery was fulfilling in ways that had nothing to do with money. For the first time in her adult life, she had begun to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved the kind of love that other people seemed to find so easily. But happiness, Isabella had learned, was a luxury that people like her couldn't afford for long. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in February. Isabella had been curled up in Alexander's penthouse, reading while he reviewed contracts, both of them comfortable in the kind of domestic silence that couples develop when they know each other's rhythms. When her phone buzzed, she almost didn't answer it. The number was unfamiliar, and she was reluctant to break the peaceful bubble they had created. She should have trusted that instinct. The voice on the other end was gravelly, aged by cigarettes and whiskey, and carried the kind of casual menace that professional criminals perfected over decades of practice. Isabella Hart? You need to come to St. Mary's Hospital. Your father's been in an accident. Isabella's blood turned to ice water in her veins. Her father, Thomas Hart, the man who had raised her alone after her mother's death, who had worked double shifts at the dock to pay for her education, who had celebrated every small victory in her life as if it were his own, was lying in a hospital bed, broken and bleeding. She had rushed to his side without explanation to Alexander, her mind focused solely on getting to the man who had sacrificed everything for her happiness. But when she arrived at the hospital, she discovered that her father's accident had been anything but accidental. Thomas Hart owed money. A lot of money. More money than a dock worker could earn in several lifetimes. Money that had been borrowed from people who collected debts with baseball bats and tire irons. His gambling addiction, a secret he had hidden from Isabella for years, had finally caught up with him in the most brutal way possible. The men who had visited him weren't interested in payment plans or negotiations. They wanted their money, plus interest, plus the additional fees that came with having to teach someone a lesson about honoring their commitments. The total amount was staggering, $250,000 that might as well have been $250 million for all the possibility Thomas Hart had of paying it. But Isabella Hart was dating Alexander Drake, one of the wealthiest men in America. And everyone knew that wealthy men would pay any price to protect the people they loved. Which meant Thomas Hart's debts had just become a very valuable commodity. The deal was presented to Isabella with a kind of businesslike efficiency that made it seem almost reasonable. Leave New York. End her relationship with Alexander. Disappear completely and never contact him again. In exchange, her father's debts would be forgiven, his medical bills would be paid, and he would be relocated somewhere safe where his past mistakes couldn't follow him. Refuse, and her father would die. Not quickly, and not cleanly. His creditors would make sure he understood the consequences of having raised a daughter who thought she was too good to help her family when they needed her most. The threat wasn't delivered with dramatic flourishes or movie villain theatrics. It was simply stated as fact, the way someone might explain the terms of a mortgage or insurance policy. Cause and effect. Choice and consequence. Love and sacrifice. Isabella had asked for 24 hours to consider her options, though they both knew she had no real choice. A daughter who would let her father die to preserve her own happiness wasn't the kind of person who deserved happiness in the first place. But 24 hours gave her time to discover something that made an already impossible situation completely devastating. She was pregnant. The pregnancy test sat on her bathroom counter like an accusation, its positive result mocking every plan she had started to make for her future. She had been carrying Alexander's child for 6 weeks, long enough for the reality to be undeniable, not long enough for her to have noticed the signs until stress and fear had made her aware of every change in her body. Now she wasn't just choosing between her father's life and her own happiness. She was choosing between her father's life and Alexander's right to know he was going to be a father. She was choosing between saving one family member and destroying her relationship with the man whose child she was carrying. Isabella spent that night walking through Central Park, her mind racing through possibilities that all ended in heartbreak. She could tell Alexander everything, throw herself on his mercy and beg him to solve her problems with his vast wealth and influence. But that would mean admitting that she came from the kind of family that generated these kinds of problems, that her father was a gambling addict who had put them all in danger, that she was exactly the kind of liability that a man like Alexander couldn't afford to have in his life. More than that, it would mean asking Alexander to become the kind of man who solved problems with money and intimidation, who used his power to make bad people disappear. She had fallen in love with his strength and integrity, not his capacity for moral compromise. She could refuse to leave, fight for her relationship and her future, and hope that love would be enough to overcome whatever consequences followed. But love wouldn't stop bullets or knives or whatever methods her father's creditors preferred. Love wouldn't heal broken bones or bring back the dead. Or she could make the sacrifice that love demanded. She could disappear, as completely and thoroughly as possible, and trust that Alexander's life would be better without the complications she had brought into it. Isabella didn't choose money over love. She chose her father's life over her own happiness. She chose to protect the man she loved from becoming someone he wouldn't be able to live with. She chose to bear the cost of her father's mistakes, rather than pass the burden on to innocent people who had never asked to be part of her family's dysfunction. The plan she executed was thorough and heartbreaking in its precision. She withdrew her small savings, sold everything she owned that had any value, and used the money to rent a storage unit for the few possessions she couldn't bear to abandon entirely. She quit her job at the gallery with a vague story about family obligations. She broke her lease and left no forwarding address. Most painfully of all, she wrote Alexander a letter that was designed to make him believe the worst about her motivations. She told him that their relationship had been a mistake, that she had realized she wanted different things from life, that she had found someone who could offer her the kind of security he never would. Every word was a lie, and every lie cut deeper than the last, but she needed him to hate her enough to let her go. She had planned to mail the letter and disappear immediately, to be gone before he could respond or try to change her mind. But when the moment came, she couldn't bring herself to send it. The letter remained in her purse undelivered, a testament to her cowardice and her lingering hope that somehow, impossible as it seemed, there might be another way. That's when Ethan Caldwell appeared like an answer to prayers she hadn't known she was praying. He found her in a coffee shop near her old apartment, surrounded by suitcases and looking like a refugee from her own life. His approach was casual, friendly, exactly what someone would expect from Alexander's business associate who had recognized a familiar face in distress. "Isabella? Isabella Hart? What are you doing here? Alex said you were out of town." She had been so grateful to see a familiar face, so desperate for any connection to the life she was losing, that she had told him everything. The gambling debts, the threats, her father's situation, even her pregnancy, all of it poured out in a flood of exhaustion and terror that left her emotionally raw and completely vulnerable. Ethan had listened with what seemed like genuine concern and growing anger on her behalf. He had offered solutions, alternatives, hope. He knew people who could help with her father's situation. He had connections that could make the debt collectors back off. Most importantly, he could speak to Alexander on her behalf, explain the situation in a way that would make him understand why she had been planning to leave. "Alex loves you," Ethan had said with what seemed like sincere conviction. "He'll move heaven and earth to keep you safe. You don't have to face this alone." Isabella had wanted to believe him so desperately that she ignored every instinct that warned her something wasn't right. She let Ethan convince her to wait, to trust him to handle the situation, to believe that there were solutions she hadn't considered. The trap had been expertly laid, and she had walked into it with the naive gratitude of someone who thought she was being rescued. Ethan's help had come in the form of a more sophisticated version of the same ultimatum her father's creditors had given her. Leave Alexander, disappear completely, and never try to contact him again. In exchange, her father's debts would be paid, his safety would be guaranteed, and she would receive enough money to disappear and start over somewhere far from New York. The difference was that Ethan's threats were wrapped in concern for Alexander's well-being rather than casual violence. He explained, with seemingly genuine regret, that Alexander's business was at a crucial stage. The kind of scandal that would result from his involvement with gambling debts and criminal associates would destroy deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Alexander's reputation, built over years of careful cultivation, would be shattered overnight. "You know how hard Alex has worked to get where he is," Ethan had said with apparent sincerity. "His entire empire is built on trust and reputation. If this gets out, if people know that his girlfriend's family has connections to organized crime, it won't just hurt him financially. It will destroy everything he's worked for his entire life." But there had been another layer to Ethan's manipulation, one that Isabella wouldn't understand until years later. He had showed her photographs, surveillance images that capture her father's beating, documentation of his gambling activities, evidence of the criminal associates who were pursuing him. The message was clear: this information existed, and it could be made public at any time. If Isabella refused to leave, if she tried to involve Alexander in her problems, the scandal wouldn't just be about gambling debts and criminal associates. It would be about Alexander Drake's poor judgment in choosing to associate with a woman whose family brought organized crime into his life. The photographs would be leaked to tabloids and business publications. The story would be that Alexander had been seduced by a woman who used her father's criminal connections to manipulate him. "I don't want to do this to you," Ethan had said, his performance of reluctant concern so perfect that Isabella had believed every word. "But I can't let you destroy Alex's life because you're too scared to make hard choices. He deserves better than this. He deserves better than you." The final twist of the knife had been Ethan's offer to help her disappear in a way that would protect Alexander's reputation. He would make sure Alexander believed she had left for someone else, someone who could offer her more than he could. It would hurt, but it would preserve his pride and his reputation. Alexander would be angry rather than heartbroken, and anger was easier to recover from than grief. "This way," Ethan had explained, "Alex gets to keep his dignity. He gets to believe that you made a choice rather than that you were driven away by circumstances beyond anyone's control. It's kinder, really." Isabella, exhausted by fear and overwhelmed by the complexity of forces arrayed against her, had agreed. She had signed papers that she didn't fully understand, accepting money that felt like payment for her own betrayal, and committed to a plan that would make the man she loved believe the worst possible things about her character. The forged evidence that convinced Alexander of her infidelity had been Ethan's master stroke. Photographs that appear to show her in intimate situations with another man, financial records suggesting she had been secretly meeting with wealthy suitors, testimony from witnesses who claimed to have seen her behaving inappropriately, all of it carefully fabricated but convincingly presented. Isabella hadn't known about any of it until years later, when she understood that Ethan's mercy in allowing Alexander to keep his dignity had actually been a weapon designed to ensure that Alexander would never try to find her or investigate the reasons for her departure. She had disappeared as thoroughly as she had promised, moving first to Philadelphia, then to Boston, and finally settling in a small apartment in Brooklyn where she could raise her son in relative anonymity. The money Ethan had given her was enough to cover basic living expenses for the first few years, but it came with conditions that made it feel more like a leash than a gift. Regular check-ins to confirm she was staying away from Manhattan. Detailed reports on her activities and associations. Strict prohibitions on any attempt to contact Alexander or anyone in his professional or personal circle. The message was clear: she was being watched, and any violation of their agreement would result in consequences that would extend far beyond her own safety. For 6 years, Isabella had lived with the knowledge that she had traded her happiness for her father's life and Alexander's reputation. She had raised their son alone, working multiple jobs to supplement the increasingly irregular payments from Ethan's organization. She had watched Daniel grow up wondering about his father, had seen him search Alexander's face in newspaper photographs and magazine articles, had answered his questions about why Daddy couldn't visit with careful lies that protected a truth too dangerous to share. But she had also preserved proof of what had been done to her and why. Recorded phone conversations with Ethan's associates. Photographs of the threats made against her father. Documentation of the financial transfers and legal agreements that had bound her to silence. Evidence that she had hoped she would never need to use, but that she had kept as insurance against the day when the price of silence became higher than the cost of truth. That day had arrived tonight in a hotel garden, when her son had asked his father if he was his daddy, And Alexander had answered yes with a kind of fierce protection that made her remember why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. Now, faced with Ethan's ultimatum and the prospect of losing Alexander and Daniel all over again, Isabella made a different choice than she had 6 years ago. This time, she chose truth over safety, love over fear, and the hope of justice over the certainty of continued suffering. "No," she said quietly, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I won't disappear again. And I won't let you use my father's mistakes to hurt my son or the man I love." Isabella reached into her purse with trembling hands and withdrew a small digital recorder that had been running since the moment Ethan appeared on the terrace. His threats, his admissions, his casual cruelty, all of it captured in his own voice, undeniable and legally actionable. But that wasn't all she had. The phone in her other hand contained years of carefully documented evidence. Recorded conversations, digital copies of threatening messages, financial records that showed the payments she had received and the conditions attached to them, even photographs of her father's injuries from 6 years ago. "I've been collecting evidence for years," she said, her voice steady despite the fear she could feel radiating from every cell in her body. "Every conversation with your people, every threat, every payment, every condition of our agreement. All of it documented and backed up in multiple locations." Ethan's confident smile faltered for the first time in the years Alexander had known him. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Isabella's question was quiet but deadly. "You want to test that theory? Because I've got recordings of you discussing the best ways to make my father's death look like an accident. I've got documentation of the forged evidence you used to convince Alexander the first was cheating on him. I've got financial records showing how you embezzled from both your company and his to fund your little campaign of manipulation." The color drained from Ethan's face as he realized that his perfectly constructed web of lies was about to be exposed in the most public, humiliating way possible. "You don't understand what you're doing. If this gets out..." "If this gets out," Alexander said, his voice carrying the kind of cold fury that had made hostile corporate raiders back down from confrontations, "you're going to prison for the rest of your life." The realization of what Ethan had done, not just to Isabella, but to him, to their son, to the 6 years they could have spent together as a family, hit Alexander like a physical blow that nearly brought him to his knees. Everything he had believed about Isabella's departure, every assumption he had made about her character, every wall he had built around his heart to protect himself from future betrayal, all of it had been built on lies crafted by the man he had trusted as a friend. Alexander's rage was beyond anything he had ever experienced in his life. It was pure and incandescent, a fury that seemed to burn away every civilized constraint he had learned in his years of corporate negotiations and social politeness. This man had stolen 6 years of his son's life. This man had made him believe that the woman he loved had betrayed him for money. This man had orchestrated their separation with the cold calculation of a chess master moving pieces on a board, never caring about the human cost of his manipulations. "You son of a bitch," Alexander said, his voice low and deadly. "You lying, manipulative son of a bitch." Ethan began backing toward the terrace doors, perhaps finally understanding that Alexander's civilized veneer was about to shatter completely. "Alex, you need to calm down. Think about what you're doing. Think about your reputation, your business relationships." Alexander's punch caught Ethan squarely in the jaw, sending him stumbling backward into one of the terrace's decorative planters. The billionaire's carefully maintained control had finally snapped under the weight of 6 years of suppressed grief and misdirected anger. "You stole 6 years of my son's life." Alexander roared, advancing on Ethan with the purposeful stride of a predator closing in for the kill. "You made me believe she betrayed me." Ethan scrambled to his feet, his perfect hair disheveled and a trickle of blood running from the corner of his mouth. "It was business, Alex. Nothing personal. You understand business." "Business." Alexander's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You call destroying my family business?" The fight that followed was brief but devastating. Alexander's rage gave him strength that years of careful corporate diplomacy had never required, while Ethan's desperation made him fight like a cornered animal. They crashed through the terrace doors into the ballroom, their struggle sending guests scattering and security rushing toward the disturbance. Crystal wine glasses shattered as they rolled across a table laden with expensive champagne. A priceless flower arrangement exploded in a shower of orchid petals and crystal shards. The string quartet stopped playing mid-note as the two men who had once been friends tried to destroy each other with their bare hands. "Security!" someone screamed. "Call security!" Hotel security arrived within minutes, followed closely by Isabella, who had stayed on the terrace to protect Daniel from witnessing the violence that his innocent questions had unleashed. By the time they were separated, both men were bloodied and disheveled, their expensive tuxedos torn and stained with wine and blood. But the physical confrontation was only the beginning of Ethan's problems. Isabella's evidence was more comprehensive than even Alexander had imagined. She had spent 6 years documenting every aspect of Ethan's manipulation, creating a paper trail that would withstand the most aggressive legal scrutiny. The recordings revealed not just threats against Isabella and her father, but discussions of other business dealings that were clearly illegal. Financial records showed that Ethan had been embezzling from his own company and Alexander's, using the stolen funds to pay for the surveillance and manipulation that had driven Isabella away. Most damaging of all were the communications between Ethan and the criminal associates who had threatened Isabella's father. The conversations revealed that Ethan hadn't just taken advantage of Thomas Hart's gambling debts. He had actively encouraged them, providing information about his daughter's relationship with Alexander and suggesting ways that the debt could be leveraged for maximum effect. As word of the confrontation spread through the wedding reception, Alexander's business associates began distancing themselves from Ethan with the speed of people fleeing a plague ship. Men who had been laughing at his jokes minutes earlier suddenly found urgent reasons to be elsewhere when hotel security finally restored order. The bride and groom, their perfect day ruined by the chaos, could only watch in horror as their reception became the backdrop for what would undoubtedly be the biggest scandal in Manhattan social circles since the last major financial fraud case. But for Alexander, none of the social or professional consequences mattered. All that mattered was the truth, finally revealed after 6 years of carefully constructed lies. Isabella hadn't chosen money over love. She had chosen her father's life over her own happiness, had sacrificed everything she cared about to protect the people she loved most. She had been a victim, not a villain. And he had spent 6 years hating her for a crime she had never committed. Police arrived within the hour, armed with warrants that suggested Isabella's evidence had been more than sufficient to launch a full investigation into Ethan's activities. The charges were extensive: extortion, embezzlement, conspiracy, fraud, and a dozen other crimes that carried sentences measured in decades rather than years. Ethan Caldwell, who had spent years cultivating his image as Manhattan's most charming and successful young businessman, found himself in handcuffs in front of hundreds of witnesses, including several journalists who had been covering the society wedding. His empire, built on manipulation and carefully orchestrated betrayals, began crumbling before the police had even finished reading him his rights. Stock prices for Caldwell Enterprises plummeted as news of his arrest spread through financial networks. Assets were frozen pending investigation. Business associates raced to distance themselves from the scandal, canceling deals and severing partnerships with the desperation of people trying to avoid guilt by association. Ethan's final desperate attempt to inflict damage came as the police were leading him away. He turned back toward Alexander and Isabella, his face twisted with a kind of malice that revealed his true nature beneath years of careful pretense. "Even if you forgive her," he called out, his voice carrying across the ballroom despite the chaos surrounding him, "you'll never forgive yourself for the years you lost. You'll never get back what I took from you. Every birthday, every first step, every bedtime story, I took all of that from you forever." The words hit Alexander like physical blows, but this time he was ready for them. This time, he had Isabella beside him and Daniel in his arms, and the truth about what had happened and why. The past was gone, stolen by a man whose jealousy and greed had cost them all far more than money or business success ever could. But the future was still theirs to write. The wedding reception finally ended in the early hours of the morning, with guests departing in clusters of whispered gossip and shocked speculation. The ballroom, once a masterpiece of elegant decoration, looked like a battlefield. Broken crystal glittered on marble floors like fallen stars. Overturned tables and scattered flower arrangements marked the path of the confrontation that had exposed years of carefully hidden truth. Alexander, Isabella, and Daniel found themselves alone in the destroyed ballroom as hotel staff began the process of cleaning up the debris. Daniel had fallen asleep in Alexander's arms during the police interviews and evidence collection, exhausted by a night that had changed his young life in ways he couldn't yet understand. Looking at his son, really looking at him for the first time with the knowledge that this was his child, Alexander felt a mixture of love and loss so intense it was almost unbearable. This little boy had been growing up without him for 5 years, developing his own personality and preferences and fears and joys, all while his father lived 15 minutes away, completely unaware of his existence. But Daniel was here now, solid and warm and real in his arms. His son's breathing was deep and peaceful, the sleep of a child who finally felt safe and protected. And Isabella was here too, no longer the ghost who had haunted his dreams for 6 years, but a real woman who had sacrificed everything for love and who was finally free to tell the truth about why. The broken chandeliers scattered rainbow light across the three of them as dawn began to break through the ballroom's massive windows. It felt symbolic somehow, the wreckage of their past reflecting the beauty of their possible future, light returning after the longest night any of them had ever endured. "We can't get back the time we lost," Alexander said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. "But we can make sure we never lose each other again." Isabella leaned against his shoulder, her own exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "I'm so sorry, Alexander. For all of it. For not trusting you enough to tell you the truth from the beginning. For letting him convince me that leaving was the only way to protect you. For raising Daniel alone when you should have been there for every moment." "You were protecting our son," Alexander said, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "You were protecting all of us, even me. I understand that now. I don't like it, and I wish you had trusted me enough to find another way, but I understand why you made the choices you did." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the sun rise over Manhattan through windows that framed the city Alexander had conquered but that had never felt like home until this moment. With Isabella beside him and Daniel in his arms, surrounded by the wreckage of Ethan's lies and the promise of truth finally revealed, Alexander felt something he hadn't experienced in 6 years: peace. "What happens now?" Isabella asked softly. Alexander considered the question carefully. There would be legal proceedings as Ethan's case went to trial. There would be media attention as the story of their separation and reunion became public. There would be business complications as Alexander's associates processed the revelation that his famous emotional detachment had been built on a foundation of lies and manipulation. But all of that was background noise compared to the reality of having his family back. "Now," he said, shifting Daniel's weight so he could look directly at Isabella, "I want to have the conversation we should have had 6 years ago. I want to know everything about Daniel, his favorite foods, his favorite books, his fears and his dreams and everything that makes him who he is. I want to know everything about you, how you survived, what you've been doing, whether you've been happy, whether you've been lonely." Isabella's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief rather than fear. "It's going to take a long time to tell you everything." "We have time," Alexander said with the quiet confidence that had built his empire and would now rebuild his family. "We have all the time in the world." Daniel stirred in his arms, blinking sleepy eyes as he tried to remember where he was and why he was sleeping in a strange place. When he saw Alexander's face, he smiled with the uncomplicated joy that only children possessed. "Are you still here?" Daniel asked, his voice soft with sleep. "I'm still here," Alexander confirmed, his throat tight with emotion. "And I'm never leaving again." "Good," Daniel said with satisfaction. "Mommy, is Alexander really my daddy?" "Yes, sweetheart," Isabella said, reaching over to smooth Daniel's hair. "He's really your daddy." Daniel considered this information with the seriousness that children brought to important revelations. Then, with typical childhood directness, he asked, "Can you teach me to tie my tie? The bow tie is too hard." Alexander's smile was the first genuinely happy expression he had worn in 6 years. "I would love to teach you to tie your tie. My father taught me when I was about your age." "Did you have a good daddy too?" "I had a wonderful daddy," Alexander said, his voice soft with memory. "And I want to be a wonderful daddy for you." "Okay," Daniel said, apparently satisfied with this arrangement. "Can we go home now? I'm hungry." Home. The word carried weight that had nothing to do with real estate or luxury accommodations. Home was wherever the three of them were together, whatever that looked like, however they chose to build their future. But first, there was something Alexander needed to do. Something he should have done 6 years ago, before fear and lies and other people's manipulation had torn them apart. "Isabella," he said, his voice carrying the formal tone he used for his most important business negotiations, "there's something I need to ask you." She looked at him with curiosity tinged by exhaustion, clearly wondering what could be so urgent that it couldn't wait until after they had all had some sleep and time to process the events of the night. Alexander gently transferred Daniel to the cushioned bench where he could continue sleeping, then stood and walked to the windows overlooking the garden terrace where their lives had been torn apart and then rebuilt in the space of a single evening. When he returned, he was carrying something that made Isabella's breath catch in her throat. The engagement ring was exactly as she remembered it, a perfect solitaire diamond surrounded by smaller stones, elegant in its simplicity but breathtaking in its beauty. It was the ring Alexander had bought 6 years ago, the ring he had planned to give her on the night she disappeared, the ring he had never returned to the jeweler because some part of him had always hoped she would come back. "I bought this 6 years ago," Alexander said, dropping to one knee beside the bench where Isabella sat frozen in shock. "I was going to propose to you the night you left. I had planned the whole evening, dinner at that little Italian place you loved, a walk through Central Park, and then this ring and a speech about how you had changed my life and made me believe in forever." Tears were streaming down Isabella's face as she stared at the ring that represented everything they had lost and everything they might still have. "I should have fought harder for us 6 years ago," Alexander continued, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I should have looked for you when you disappeared. I should have trusted my heart instead of listening to lies. I should have been a better man then, but I want to be the man you deserve now." He took her left hand in his thumb tracing over the ring finger that had remained bare for 6 years of separation and struggle. "Marry me, Isabella. Let me be the father Daniel deserves, and the husband you never stopped being to my heart. Let me prove that love really can conquer all obstacles, even the ones we create for ourselves." Isabella's yes was barely audible through her tears, but it was the most beautiful sound Alexander had ever heard. The ring slid onto her finger as if it had been waiting 6 years to find its proper home, and when Alexander rose to kiss her, it felt like the sun finally emerging after the longest winter in history. Their kiss was tender and desperate and full of longing for all the kisses they had missed, all the moments they had been denied, all the love they had carried separately that could finally be shared. It tasted like tears and promises, and the kind of hope that only comes after surviving the worst that life can offer. Daniel, awakened by his parents' emotion, opened his eyes to see them embracing in the morning light streaming through the ballroom windows. With the intuitive understanding that children possessed, he smiled sleepily and said, "Does this mean we're going to be a real family now?" "Yes," Alexander said, gathering both Isabella and Daniel into his arms. "We're going to be a real family now." And as the sun rose fully over Manhattan, casting golden light over the wreckage of their past and the promise of their future, Alexander Drake finally understood what it meant to have everything that truly mattered. Not the empire that bore his name, not the wealth that had defined his success, not the power that had shaped his reputation, but this woman and this child and this love that had survived betrayal and separation and 6 years of carefully constructed lies. He was home at last. 6 months later, Alexander Drake stood at another altar, but this time as a groom. The man who had once believed love was a luxury he couldn't afford now waited with barely contained emotion as the doors at the back of the church opened to reveal his bride. Daniel carried the rings with the solemnity of a child who understood he had been given the most important job in the world. His small chest was puffed with pride at being his daddy's best man, his miniature tuxedo perfectly tailored, his dark hair combed with a precision that only comes from a father's careful attention. When the moment came to present the rings, he stepped forward with a whispered "Here, Daddy" that echoed through the chapel and brought tears to eyes that had witnessed decades of society weddings but had never seen love quite this pure. In the front row sat Isabella's father, alive and healthy, finally free from the shadows that had nearly destroyed his daughter's happiness. Thomas Hart looked nothing like the broken man who had been beaten for gambling debts 6 years earlier. The federal investigation that followed Ethan's arrest had revealed the truth, that Thomas had been a target rather than simply a victim, that his troubles had been deliberately orchestrated to create the crisis that drove Isabella away. Now he watched his daughter marry the man she had sacrificed everything to protect, his eyes bright with tears of joy rather than regret. The ceremony was everything their first chance at happiness should have been. Isabella walked down the aisle wearing her grandmother's dress, altered to fit perfectly, carrying all the blessing of generations of women who had loved and been loved. Alexander's hands trembled as he slipped the wedding ring onto her finger, joining it with the engagement ring that had waited 6 years to fulfill its purpose. Their vows spoke of forgiveness and second chances, of love that had survived separation and lies and the worst that jealous enemies could devise. When they kissed as husband and wife, it sealed not just their marriage but their victory over everyone who had tried to keep them apart. But the shadow of their ordeal wasn't entirely gone. Ethan Caldwell remained in federal prison, serving a sentence that would keep him behind bars for decades. His corporate empire had crumbled within days of his arrest, stock prices plummeting as investors fled the scandal. Assets were frozen, business partnerships dissolved, and the carefully constructed web of influence he had built over years of manipulation collapsed like a house of cards. The courts had ordered Ethan's remaining wealth to be divided among his victims as restitution, not just Isabella and her family, but dozens of other people whose lives had been damaged by his schemes. The investigation had revealed a pattern of manipulation and financial fraud that stretched back years, touching competitors, employees, and anyone else who had stood in the way of his ambitions. His final desperate attempt to inflict damage had come during his sentencing hearing, when he had looked directly at Alexander and Isabella in the courtroom gallery and said, "Even if you forgive her, you'll never forgive yourself for the years you lost. Every birthday, every first step, every bedtime story, I took all of that from you forever." The words had been meant to wound, to plant seeds of lasting resentment that would poison their reconciliation. But they had failed to find their target. Alexander and Isabella had looked at each other, then at Daniel sitting between them, and understood that while the past was gone, the future was entirely theirs to write. But for Alexander, the greatest victory wasn't Ethan's downfall or the vindication of Isabella's innocence or even the restoration of his own reputation. The greatest victory was the sound of his son calling him daddy without hesitation, the feeling of Isabella's hand in his as they faced their future together, and the knowledge that love, real, honest, fighting for each other love, had conquered every obstacle that had been placed in their path. The lost years would never be recovered. Alexander would never witness Daniel's first steps or hear his first words or be there for the countless small moments that make up a childhood. Those had been stolen by a man whose jealousy had nearly destroyed everything good in their lives. But what they had now was precious beyond measure. Daniel had a father who would never take his presence for granted, who treasured every bedtime story and celebrated every small achievement with the enthusiasm of someone who understood how easily it all could have been lost. Isabella had a husband who knew the true cost of their happiness and would spend the rest of his life proving himself worthy of her sacrifice. Love had won. Not because it was easy, but because it was worth fighting for. Do you think Alexander and Isabella made the right choice? Could you forgive someone who kept your child from you, even if they had a good reason? And do you believe that true love really can conquer all obstacles? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of love, betrayal, and redemption. Because everyone deserves a love story worth fighting for.